This episode is brought to you by Optimized Works. We help service-led organizations streamline complex operational workflows and reduce manual inefficiencies to improve accuracy, compliance, and scalability. So today on Beyond Scaling, our guest is Patrick Corbett, CEO of Vanguard Research and Title Services, which is a New York-based title insurance and research firm. Patrick works in a part of real estate that most people never see. So when someone buys a property, they often think about the lender, the realtor, and the attorney. But behind the scenes, there's an entire layer of research, compliance, risk management that's happening to ensure the property ownership is legally sound and protected. So that's what I want to delve into today, Patrick. So first of all, I appreciate you joining me. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lloyd. It's a pleasure to be on.
Pleasure's all mine, sir, I assure you. Patrick, when we spoke, we had a conversation last week before last. There was something you mentioned that really stuck with me. You described title insurance as the hidden industry that sits right in the middle of these real estate transactions, right? But most people, I think it's fair to say, don't even realize it exists. Or if they do, they're not paying a great deal of attention to it, right?
That's correct.
So when people buy property, they think about lenders, agents, attorneys, as I mentioned. But the title process, this is incredibly complex layer, right? Operating behind the scenes. So for someone that's never really thought about title insurance before, and it's relatively new to me. So when I got mentioned on a previous podcast, I started looking into it. I reached out to you. So I suppose for someone that hasn't given this a great deal of thought, what actually happens behind the curtain during a real estate transaction?
Certainly. So there are two pieces of the real estate settlement process that a company like ours participates in. And both, they're two different components of real estate settlement. So the settlement piece could be thought of as the final transfer, right? I am getting the title from the seller with the intent to go use and occupy that land, and I give them something in exchange, right? A fair price. And before that, though, the purchaser, at least in New York, the legal theory is that the purchaser has responsibility to understand the legal rights that they are acquiring, so that they need to sort of do their due diligence to understand the state of the legal title to the land they're intending to purchase. And so in order to do that, they have to conduct some research into the public record. So the index where land transfers are recorded, and legal instruments affecting rights and title to land, and then some other public record sort of touches on that, such as the U.S. District Court for bankruptcies and so forth, or companies that own assets as under the entity. But this is a complicated process, and it can span 40, 80, 100, 200 years in some cases. And so for the layperson could indeed go look at these public records on their own and try to determine, am I safe, right? Do I understand what it is that I'm looking to purchase? What are my rights in this? Does the seller, in fact, have the legal right to the land they claim to have, right? And that they're going to give me? What else? Is there anyone else that might have some right legally to do something to or with this property? And so that, I would say, it kind of falls under this concept of title assurance, right? You want to be sure that what you're purchasing is yours, right? Free and clear, right? You want to be the only person that can do anything you want legally with that piece of land. And you can't pick up land, right? You can't just hand it to another person. You can't put it in your pocket, so to speak. And so, unlike driving a car off a lot, right? Similar to, but a little different, right? I can't just take this car somewhere, can't take that land somewhere. What you're getting is a bundle of rights that have been defined by law that describe for an individual what they can and can't actually do with respect to this real property. And so that one piece, that research, is a form of title assurance. And historically, attorneys would utilize this research. They would conduct it themselves. They have a direct examination, make a direct examination of the public record. And over time, lay persons, right, started getting into the business, and so attorneys backed off of that and began relying on this research that the lay person would create. But they would review that and they would provide some certification, right? They would give their opinion as to the state of the title for conveyancing purposes. So their opinion, their expertise would back the transaction, right? Or not just theirs, but both, right? The counsel for both buyer and seller and bank, they would all, weigh in on the process and decide, is this a good transfer of title or not? And what are the issues that we've got to deal with and fix? And so fast forward to the 30s is when the first title insurance became available in the market, as actually created by a life insurance company. And so it was part of so it got birthed out of the insurance world. And it was also a form of title assurance, but the difference is that it gives a financial indemnity. So it's not just someone's expertise or opinion backing the conveyance or transfer. It's someone is saying, I'm financially liable if you don't get the legal title as described, right, as you intend, right? Okay. So that's the key difference, is that the title insurer has a duty to examine the title, right, to provide an expert, right, opinion as to the rights, encumbrances, the issues, right, involved. But they're giving a financial backing, and they're giving their guarantee to legally defend, right, should a proper claim arise after the purchase. That's their obligation. So it's a little different than just relying on attorneys, right, to effect the transaction or transfer from one person to another. And it's not to downplay, certainly the role that attorneys play or their expertise in real property law matters and civil law matter. It can get quite complex.
Of course.
Yeah.
It's interesting. It reminds me, there's an article I read. Oh, I hope this wasn't some BS article, but I read an article a while back, and it was about a guy who sold an airport that wasn't his. He actually sold, and the transaction went through, and they took the money for an entire airport that he didn't own. And you touched on the beginning there, making sure that the land is theirs for you to enable to buy. I'm gonna have to look that up, and I'm tempted to pause now to have a look at it just to make sure I'm not completely. I haven't read some clickbait title. What are the most, I suppose, what are the most common pitfalls then that you will discover during your research that if you weren't involved, someone else would likely get tripped up by?
Sure. I think title fraud, as you touched on, is still a leading cause of title claims. So if we look at claims made to the title insurers, title fraud is still a top claim.
When you say title fraud, what is that? Somebody claiming this land is mine and I'm going to sell it to you, but it's not actually theirs. So they're selling land that's
correct,
not theirs. Wow, that still happens.
Yep. Fraud and forgery. So someone misrepresenting themselves, or as often can happen, someone with a partial interest in land attempts to convey the whole, or certainly identity theft. It can be a factor. Someone is pretending to be or representing themselves to be someone else in order to make the transfer, or a forged document, right, or a document that is otherwise defective, even if the intent was legitimate.
Yeah.
The document itself could be, misdrafted or have some sort of legal defect that would make it of no effect, right, as if the transfer had not happened.
Yeah. Interesting. And the devil's in the detail. Why anybody would choose to take this on themselves, I don't know. I mean, speaking of which, Patrick, what originally brought you into the titling?
I had no idea that it existed. I needed a job. As so often happens, I had a friend, he since passed away now, but he was a part of this company actually, and I was working in Syracuse, New York, where we're headquartered, kind of doing something completely different for another company, and the contract I was working under ran out, and so they sort of let the team go. So I was just kicking around, and he got wind of my availability and said, "Hey, why don't you come apply with us? We're looking for a title abstractor." Right? And I, of course, had no idea, just not a clue. I tried to look at what they did and look into it, and I thought they kept a bunch of important papers in filing cabinets for people and like took them out when they wanted them. So that was the extent of my knowledge of the industry at that point. But I said, "Hey, I'll give it a shot," and I did a job. And the rest is history, as they say.
What kept you in the fields? What do you enjoy about?
Actually, I took a break in the middle for about a couple of years,
Okay.
and kind of got back into it. Just as some events happened with the company, and so I said, "Hey, I'll step back in to fill a gap," and just one of those coincidental timing things that the opportunity arose for me to take over, and we did. We said, "Well, I believed in the industry. I mean, it's an intriguing. It can be incredibly frustrating business at times,
Sure.
but it really is an important. It's an important thing that it often gets overlooked, and I think for me, there's a lot of potential for where this business can go, and I'm proud of what we do. I think I'm really interested in seeing the change that's coming in the industry and the economy broadly, more broadly, right? The advent of technology, it's a little nerve wracking at times, right? There's so much, in the question to what is the rise of AI, and there's all sorts of different technology out there. Compliance, legal, regulatory issues are getting more complex, but I think the promise of what was possible in this space, I think, is really interesting, and it's headed in a really good direction, and I'm excited to be a part of that.
Yeah, excellent. At what point when you joined, I mean, it's been some years back now, but at what point when you joined did you realize just how complex this industry is? Because from the outside looking in, I'll be honest, Patrick, it looks like a minefield, right? You're looking in, there's so much regulatory red tape to get through and so many hurdles to overcome, and the stakes are high, right? There's a lot of pressure on getting it right. So at what point is it that complex, or is it just because I'm a layman on the outside looking in?
It is that complex. I think those when you're in the business, right, at a certain point, it's what you do, and so kind of it's business as usual, to a point, but it is complex. I mean, there are no less than more than a dozen different regulations, both statutory, so of the law, and regulatory filing issues, that we have to comply with at any given time just to open the door. Well, and that's specific to the industry, on top of all the normal things that every business needs to comply with for wage and hour laws and doing business. And so but it didn't start out that way. I think it's, anytime you're dealing with an aspect of law that's open to some interpretation, and subject to change, right? Albeit infrequent, it can get complicated enough in and of itself. But I think the regulatory complexity has increased over the last decade. It really started, I think our this business, at least in this area, I wouldn't say it has been unregulated, but it has been less heavily or closely regulated than it has in the last 10 years or so.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because if you think of the regulators, right, there's nowhere There's no world where I can imagine them starting the year and saying, okay, we're gonna loosen regulations this year. Right? The inverse is always going to be true. That they're there to regulate, they're there to make things, safer in their words. So they surely they're going to continue tightening the screws and making it more and more quote unquote safe. Right? Now, whether it does or doesn't, or whether it's regulation for the sake of regulation's sake, it's not my place to even hop in there. But it's always going to become more and more regulated. So that the fact it's become increasingly more regulated over the last 10 years is that a trend I suppose you're expecting to see continue?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The state, leaves at the state level, they leave their rulemaking somewhat open-ended. So it's not something final that can get amended by later legislation. They intentionally leave aspects of the rules open so that it's at their discretion at any point in the future to change or amend or add to or reinterpret even, right? That's the thing, is they can decide at a later time and look back at something that they said before. So, well, we didn't actually mean that. We actually mean this.
Yeah.
And then that's in their purview to do. And between the federal level and the state level and local level, right? That's the other thing, is custom and practice. Locally may not have the force of law per se, but it is a set of mores and expectations that govern, right, our behavior and our interactions and what people expect, especially professionals. And we're sort of behind these attorney practitioners and even banks and other institutions that sort of touch real property and transactions. They all have their requirements and their needs, and we're essentially a service business. So we're a para-professional service, and so we don't have the authority to practice law as such, even though we do provide this very technically competent service in that sense. And so we have to walk a line where we are increasingly relied on for the expertise that we deliver, for the solutions that we can provide to help support the real estate settlement process. But there's a line, right, that kind of can't cross at some point. But that line is different in different areas all the way across the country. And so as transactions, right, we used to say that all title is local. And I would say that is still true to a point. But the transactions we've been a part of, I think increasingly they might revolve around the sort of geographic, piece of land, that's here, right, in upstate New York, but the parties are everywhere. I mean, they could be out of state, they could be out of the country, they could be somewhere, and all of these different stakeholders are now getting involved to effect this one transfer, and they're not all here. And so it's not quite the same as having local people that you know and trust, and everybody's sitting down at the closing table across from one another, to finish the deal, right? If they're states away and their countries away, and practitioners involved representing them to help move the deal along are operating in areas that have different customs and different practices and subject to maybe different regulation. And so it gets more complex from that vantage point also.
Yeah, I'm sure. Because somebody mentioned previously when we were talking about this, I think you just touched on it just now. It's not, there's a federal level, there's a state level, but there's actually even counties operate differently, right? So in New York, how many counties are in New York, Patrick?
There are 62 counties.
So you've got to keep up with the pace of 62 counties operating and maybe interpreting things slightly different as well. How does that work operationally? How does, so let me rephrase that. What kind of knowledge does a title company have to maintain to stay compliant across all of these counties?
So it depends on how far afield you want to work or need to work. There are companies that they just focus on their county, or one or a county adjacent. So that they very much we specialize here, and this is our work. Just over time, we kept meeting need and demand, and right. And so our operation doesn't necessarily get bigger in the sense that our brick and mortar is getting bigger, but we are operating in more and more counties, and we're doing more and more transactions. And so the further afield you go, you always have to be aware of what's happening right at the federal and state level. You have to be aware of what regulations are affecting the banks right that are funding these transactions. You have to what's happening in the civil law space, right? Because litigation over real property is a one branch of law, and that can affect the legal title to land and the records that you find and disclose. And so there's the broad regulatory space that you have to pay attention to as a practitioner, but then there's the local custom, right, county by county. And so those you have to kind of, at least up here, I found that we've felt our way along. There are resources through trade associations and attorney associations that exist at the state and county level, where they provide resource to say, hey, this is how we expect business to be done in our area. And sometimes you just have to feel your way through it. You get into the middle of it and you do it and you learn. And then you build that experience over time.
Yeah, I'm sure. And does that information largely live in systems, or is that in people like yourself?
Yeah, I would say that from an organizational standpoint, it can be as different as every company out there that's engaging in some settlement service. For us, it's a little bit of both, right? So we don't rely on third-party systems. We design and build all of our own production software, and I know some days I think I must be crazy, or I like pain somehow. Well, maybe that's. But for us, we found that to do some of the things that we do in a coordinated, cohesive way, to maintain that institutional knowledge, we've just found that being able to design our own systems to the way that we need to work and want to work, is just better at the end of the day. We have more control over that. We can tune our system to carry that institutional knowledge forward, right? And so I don't know that we've got it right all the time, but there is that balance between letting people be people and use their expertise and unique judgment to enhance the work and service every day, but also to sort of build in this to our systems externally, right, as an objective reference that lets people focus on the things where their thought and judgment is more valuable.
Yeah.
Right. And I don't think I can't say that we've hit this perfect balance ever. But that's the idea, the spirit that we try to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough balance you're trying to find, you're trying to meet there, isn't it? Because I work in a similar space, right? I work with data, I work with knowledge, and making that as efficient as possible, but at the same time allowing the insurance broker to have a human there making a defined decision. That's what I think the secret to this technology is really keeping humans in the loop and having humans driving the software, driving the strategy, driving the outcome, and selecting, selecting what gives them confidence rather than just being presented with an answer. And I think a lot of third-party technology out there at the moment, that's what they produce, and good to them. There's a large client base out there for that, where people just want to click a button and get an answer and rely on the tool. But one thing we know about these tools is they can make mistakes, right? It's very apparent. There's a little riddle for AI that just recently a friend of mine sent it to me for fun. That's how I spend my weekends, Patrick. But it was the prompt was, you type into the language model, my car needs to be cleaned. I live a 5-minute walk from the car wash. Should I just walk there? Right? And the AI model just craps out. The AI model's just going, yeah, I think it would be a good idea for you to get some fresh air. I know you've been working hard today. It's like, I'm going to wash that. It's very interesting. It's very interesting. So, and listen, that's a very simple hallucination, right? That's what they call it, hallucinations. It's a very simple error that it can make. But if you translate that across to what you were doing, and you haven't got the right guardrails in place, and you haven't got a human overseeing the output, you can get yourself into trouble. And the regulators, they don't care whether it's AI, it's on you, right, as the business owner.
That's right.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting. So when you look at the regulatory pressure, you mentioned it's extremely high. What are the consequences, or what are we talking about if something gets missed? Is this purely financial? Are there legal consequences for the business? It feels like you carry a lot of pressure in your position, for one of the unsung heroes of the real estate market. But you seem to carry a lot of that pressure. Is that fair to say?
It is. We produce products that all sorts of stakeholders are relying on in order to make these transactions happen at the end of the day. And so, and of course, as with so many aspects of life, right? Nobody wants to take responsibility, legally, right? There are amazing professionals every day who are doing their utmost for their customers and the clients, but it's a fiction of the legal process, right? Where somebody they're going to make it so that we shift liability wherever we can, right? And that's baked into the insurance world, right? We mitigate risk, right? Wherever possible, we're willing to take it on. We mitigate it, to almost nothing, right? If at all possible. And so those are, that's a mentality that you encounter. And so when it really comes down to, hey, this mistake got made, after you sift through, right? Well, was it really our mistake? Was it really their mistake? Was it partly their mistake, partly our mistake, right? Somebody's got to step up and take ownership. And we've been in that position, where it may not be a violation of a regulatory, matter. We're not sort of non-compliant, right? Which the stakes are high enough for that, right? Civil fines, even prison time in certain cases. But at the end of the day, it's me and my customer, right? Me and this partner that I have to do business with over and over and over. Or even if I don't do business with them often, they still know so many other practitioners, right, in the space that we do business with. And so the risk, even if it's not a financial risk or an extreme financial risk, there is always a risk to reputation. And being able to manage that it can get tricky. Sometimes there's a pastor friend of I knew years ago. He was a pastor in Ghana, and he always used to say that sometimes the innocent have to apologize to the guilty for the sake of the kingdom of God, and that sentiment stuck with me as a business owner. So there are times when I have to make a decision for the sake of relationship and take ownership of a thing that maybe I don't need to, or certainly don't want to.
Yeah.
And I think that's the more difficult decision at times, when it has a greater impact at times than just breaking the law. Not that I advocate that, but because that's down to do I settle, right, and pay tens of thousands of dollars to help remediate this issue, even if, right, it really wasn't my problem to begin with, right? And to be able to make that decision as a service partner and have that mentality. I'm partnering with these people, right? I'm serving customer. I'm serving someone, right, whose livelihood is mixed up in this, right? Their business venture is mixed up in this. I think that's the thing that it can get overlooked, right? Especially in the side is reputation. Management, I guess, to say, right? But it's not about necessarily making yourself look good, right? Because there are a lot of businesses that can make themselves look good by appearing to do the right things, or just enough of the right thing at the right times. It's doing the thing you think is right for the sake of just doing the right thing, but not have it seen or understood, right?
Yeah.
You kind of have to take the hit in a public way to a point, but work through it to keep going, right?
Yeah, we've all been there. We've all been there, Patrick, and it gets to a point where you can continue the debate over where fault lies and risk, tarnishing your reputation, tarnishing the relationship, or just as you say, kind of taking it on the chin. And at least that way you come out, they can see you're a person with integrity and doing the right thing. Yeah, it's a tough spot. It's a very tough spot to be in. When we spoke about this previously, you mentioned there's a new federal regulation coming in. I think you mentioned like 110 data points for residential transfers. Is that what when you touched on earlier when you said new regulations coming in? Is that how does that work in layman's terms? First of all, when you say it's 100 data points for residential transfers, what I don't need the 100. This isn't a spot test. I would like to get a taste of what that means.
Sure. Yeah. So, and that's regulation promulgated by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. So it's part of the United States Department of Treasury, and their whole job, right, is to combat illegal financial activity. Wow. And so affecting all financial systems.
Yeah. No, go ahead. You've lost an earpiece. That's all right. We'll chop that out. Start again.
So the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network is released a new rule that they've developed under purview of the Department of the Treasury, and they had some success. So historically, they would require certain real estate transactions in key metropolitan areas around the country, with high activity, right? So New York City, Los Angeles, California, Dallas, Texas, right? The bigger cities, a lot of transfers. And so they would require a report to be made of certain kinds of residential real estate transfers. And so companies that would participate, like ours, would have to make a report monthly or quarterly, however long the rule required, and they'd have to submit this information back to FinCEN, who would compile the data, right? So one of their jobs is to disseminate this information to law enforcement agencies like the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and so they would use this data in their investigations. So if they were investigating fraud or money laundering, for example, they would rely on this data to help connect the dots and drill down to see who's at fault. And there was some success, right? So regulated banks already have to make some sort of reporting under the anti-money laundering rules. And so the FinCEN regulators were looking, they were looking at the data they were getting from banks, and they're looking at the data they were getting from these residential reports, and they were saying, wow, there's a 46% match here. I think certainly, and I think the statistic they put out was 40% or over 40% success in law enforcement activity as a direct result of the information obtained from this reporting. And so they said, well, this is really helping. So we're going to expand the data collection. So the new rule that just went into effect on the 1st of March requires a certain set of data to be reported for every real estate transaction that is not being backed by funds given from a traditional lender, essentially, right? So they're trying to widen the net and catch these, really under the radar cash transactions, so that they have this data set that they can look to when they have to make investigation and make bring a case against somebody.
Okay. And how much of a shift is this operationally, title companies?
It's pretty significant, especially for the kind of title company, right, that's doing business. There are some, I would say, title companies, to use that phrase, that handle the entire transaction end to end. So they represent all the parties, they hold all the money in escrow and make sure it gets to where it needs to. They effect the transfer. In an area like ours, we work with attorneys on either side, right? So the attorneys are often the settlement agent themselves, or an attorney is representing the bank, right? They're acting as settlement agent. They're handling the money. They're contacting the parties. They're arranging all the pieces for the deal to happen. So the responsibility typically will fall on those entities, right? Those persons who are providing that service in the transaction. For us, I think we are part of the reporting cascade, so to speak, right? So we could have a responsibility to make this report. And we also provide services, right? We open our production systems to some of our partners to perform some of these functions through us, even if we're not necessarily providing that function. And so, again, it's questions of we're a service partner. And so to help facilitate this collection and gather the data gathering is the more complicated piece. It's knowing where this information is coming from, when it has to be collected, how it has to be collected, and then ultimately reported once the transaction's done. But once the transaction's done, it's hard to get the information you need. Nobody's coming back to the table. And so, it's the issues of collection and timing and, storage, right? This is a lot of private information that's being required, names and, bank account information and information about the transaction and who's making it. And so there's, where do you store this information, right? How do you keep it? How do you transmit it? How do you get it in front of the right people? It can be complex, especially for smaller firms. They don't have.
It can leave you vulnerable. I mean, in the UK, over the last 12 months, we've had several high-profile cases where large companies, Marks and Spencer, I don't know if you know Marks and Spencer, large supermarket chain in the UK, was being held ransom over, someone had breached their system and taken a load of customer data and were being held ransom. Their shelves were empty for weeks while they were holding off paying this ransom fee because they refused to pay the ransom fee and took an enormous hit on their revenue as a result of that. But they held their ground. It's interesting. Yeah, it's very interesting. One thing I find fascinating about this work, Patrick, is it feels like even lenders and brokers that are involved in the transaction, right? It's highly likely a lot of those don't fully understand what's happening behind the scenes, right? Because it's such a nuanced and such a niche area to be working in. Why do you think the work that you guys do is invisible almost to the rest of the real estate ecosystem?
Yeah, we do have some visibility. Certainly, realtors or real estate agents, loan officers and banks, they have an idea. They know that we exist, right?
Of course. Yeah.
They know that the pieces, in place. But so often in our area, particularly the attorney is is the one, right? So you especially for lay person, or I'm sorry, the average home buyer, right? They're working with their real estate agent, and the real estate agent is working with the attorney, right? And the bank, right? The loan officer, they have an attorney, right? So everybody's working usually with the attorneys, or the ones that are interfacing with these different stakeholders. And so we're kind of behind the attorney most of the time. And so, right, we're just the amorphous title company, that's doing some stuff, right? The attorney's waiting on, is how often how it goes. And so we don't typically take a order request direct from consumers. We do occasionally, but most often it is filtered through the attorney.
Okay, yeah, and
So they're more visible.
yeah, yeah, that's a good explanation. I was kind of thinking it's almost, it's almost painful to think about because it's quite complex and it's so technical. So I think like myself, the layman like myself, it's something that, you know, we know it's there, but to try and understand it hurts. you know, it's almost painful. It's almost painful to get in and understand. So you're better off just kind of, I'll leave that to my attorney. He'll sort that out and it'll get dealt with. Yeah, it's interesting. It's very interesting to me anyway. When you look at your business today, you've described an industry which is incredibly knowledge heavy, right? Highly regulated, operating across dozens of local variations and, state variations. When you look at the business today, what's the single operational bottleneck then that slows transactions down the most for you?
Yeah, I think for us, it's still the time investment required to conduct the research, for the property titles.
Yeah.
Because every county recording or indexing system is different. And you think about every clerk is locally elected, and they have the responsibility to maintain these records in a manner that they see fit. And so you go back to 200 years, and every county recorder that's ever been elected, right, gets, okay, well, every time technology changes, or as time goes on, each successive clerk is implementing a different piece of their system. And some of the title that's necessary, you have to have a long span to review. And I guess legal theory is that potentially anything that occurred since the beginning of time could impact the marketability of title today. And so in New York State, there's no marketability standard. There's no regulation that says, okay, well, after 30 years, we're going to ignore anything that happened, beyond 30 years, for example. That's not, it doesn't exist in New York, although it does in some states. And I think so that the timing, that you have to put into compiling these documents and finding them and putting them in a logical order that can be reviewed and interpreted. And there are so many, I think the other piece of it, for at least in this area, is there's so many hands, right? So one party is responsible for providing this piece, another party is responsible for providing that piece, and right, the bank gets involved because they're funding everything. And so that all this work product, this material, has to go back and forth between all these different parties. And so this attorney is preparing some documents and that attorney is preparing other documents, but everybody's got to look at it all. And if there's an issue, right, everybody's got to talk about it and figure it out. Okay, how does this impact my client? How does that impact my client? Right. And there's a lot of stakeholders involved. And so, we try to do what we can through our systems to make our piece of the process as fast as possible. Right. So that's where it kind of, it comes down to at the end of the day. Yeah. We're not the stumbling block.
Yeah.
But that's still the reality. Just no matter how technology changes, how fast, right, it develops in amazing capabilities, that we have today, it still comes down to somebody's got to put their eyes on this document somewhere, right?
Yeah.
This in an index in this office, and you got to get it and then do something else with it, right, and read it and interpret it. And so that's still the the time killer.
It's interesting. It's very interesting, Patrick. It's been I feel like we could do Joe Rogan here and just talk for 3 hours about this before I even scratch the surface and get enough knowledge that I'd really need to truly understand everything you do. But it's certainly an interesting niche you will find yourself in, and hopefully this has opened the eyes for many people. Appreciate your time today, Patrick. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.